Hello and welcome to the Project Doctor podcast. My name is Ralph Goossens and I'm your project management expert, presenting you with all the things you need to know about project management. Project Doctor is here to provide you with expert analysis and with recipes that you can put to practical use immediately after the podcast, so stay tuned. I'm very glad to hear that so many of you have already shown up, so let's get started right away. This is episode 13 of the podcast series where I talk about the project canvas. The canvas is a map of the project landscape divided into 12 tiles. I've described it in the first episode of this series. In this 13th episode, I'm going to talk about resources. Have you ever been short on resources in a project? Or have you had problems getting the right resources? Or have you struggled to put resources to the best of use? Or difficulties keeping track of resource usage? Then keep listening. I will definitely share some insights and practical advice for you. Also, don't forget to go to projectdoctor.online to download the extras with this episode. Every project needs resources. As the name implies, they are the fuel and the building blocks of it. But what types of resources are there anyway? I can see several types of resources that projects will need. First, materials. This could be raw materials or semi-finished products. This terminology suggests that your project is dealing with physical deliverables. However, even if the end results of your project are non-material, such as software, you may still have to think about this in view of the make or buy decision. The buying can then involve, for instance, acquiring a license to use the software, or actually purchasing the full intellectual property rights to some software product. The second type is money. Without a budget, you probably don't get very far. There are very few projects where all materials are provided for free and all man-hours are voluntary work. Even in one charity project that I run, hosting the website costs a little money. Then there's human hours. No project is done by robots only, so you will always need people to bring their time, in which they set their expertise and their skills to good use. So in a sense, also the expertise and these skills are a resource too. Then there's facilities, basic accommodation and tools for your team to work with. Think of office space, meeting rooms, a coffee corner, the stuff that makes life easier for the team and creates a working environment where they can be productive. And there is tools. Things your team needs in order to build the deliverables. This can be hardware tools or software tools, or both of them. Tools are usually rented or licensed, because on the project level it doesn't make sense to buy them. Tools are generally viewed as an investment, a capital expenditure, whereas tool use is a cost, an operational expenditure. Finally, there are consumables. Think of power, electricity, printer toner, printer paper, coffee beans, drinking water, soft drinks. Basically everything that perishes after it's been used. So let's focus a bit on materials first. If the material you need to buy for your project concerns the intellectual property to some software product, my advice is to get in touch with someone who knows the legal arrangements around IP in the part of the world where your project is located, and also in the part of the world where you're actually purchasing the IP from. In practice, the British American and the EU regulations on intellectual property and copyright are dominant, and they are definitely not entirely identical. Next, let's talk about money. In order to get the required money available for your project, you will need to have a budget that you can explain or defend if the mode of communication is a bit more harsh. And you can only arrive at a sensible budget if you have at least the outlines of a plan. Therefore, you must have a basic product breakdown and the associated work breakdown. You can listen to episode 8 of this podcast where I have covered planning, and the topics of product breakdown structure and work breakdown structure have been covered to some depth. In one example from my experience, I had been asked to do a workshop at the headquarters of a multinational retail company, with chains of stores all across Europe. They were planning to roll out a new ERP system to all their subsidiaries. This ERP was an off-the-shelf application with one module heavily modified to fit the business requirements of their particular industry. We ran a multi-day workshop to define the generic PBS and WBS, knowing that there would be country-specific variations when the rollout per country would take place. We actually put placeholders for those country-specific tasks into the planning template. For example, one local task in every country would be to set up the tax parameters and to configure the rules for bookkeeping in the financial module. Based on the generic planning, we were able to come up with a ballpark budget for each country. And that, in turn, enabled this company to define a budget for the whole program Europe-wide. Then about human hours. A major part of any budget, at least in IT projects, will be the human hours that go into it. I think there are two relevant aspects here. Estimating the effort, which is directly linked to the PBS and the WBS in your planning, and knowing the expertise and knowledge that you will need. This is why in any planning you will tag or mark the various tasks according to the type of resource that can work on them. Architects, developers, testers, process engineers, subject matter experts, business representatives, etc. In order to make the human hours available, assuming that you have at least the initial budget approved by your sponsor, you will have to start recruiting. It's important for you as project manager to know the procedures in your sponsor's company. Do they use RFI, request for information, RFP, request for proposal, and RFQ, request for quotation, procedures? And do they have templates for all of these? In most government organizations, the rules will be strict, especially if the budget is above some threshold and public tenders are applicable. Do make sure to allot enough time for the sourcing procedures in such an environment. In one project, where I was assisting a software vendor, they were tendering with a government agency. The amount of documentation that we needed to prepare for the RFP was so huge that we literally needed to pack it in a box for delivery at the agency. The whole package weighed several kilos. Then about facilities and tools. It's important to know the tools and the equipment and the working space arrangements that you will need, both for accommodating the team and for the construction of the actual end products. As for software tools, make sure to plan some time for setting them up and adapting them to the workflow that you want to use. In one project, where I was leading a team using the Agile approach, the sponsor made the Jira tool available. Since that organization did not yet have a template for Jira from previous projects, it took several days to create the initial setup. And then, after we were like 1 month into the project, experience showed us some lessons in how we should change that initial setup, which took another day or so to adapt. Not only did it take time for the system administrator to set up all the parameters, we also had to provide some documentation or basic training to the team in order to get used to the workflow. There was of course a good enough payback from all of this in terms of efficiency of working and self-documentation of our progress. But it took some initial overhead in fine-tuning the tool to our needs. Now that we've covered the various types of resources, and assuming you've been able to secure all of them for your project, the materials, the budget, the human hours, the facilities, the tools, then you as a project manager will have to put all of them to good use in the actual execution of your project. This relates to the topic of organization and team, and I've talked about those in episode 3 of this podcast series, and also to deliverables, covered in episode 10. The final step will then be to track resource usage and to report on it to your sponsor. And of course, you will also decide on corrective actions yourself if you find out that resource usage is not according to plan, or if the productivity lags behind the baseline. And I have talked about planning and baseline in episode 8 of this series. The most important technique for keeping track of resource usage and assessing your progress is called Earned Value Analysis, or EVA. Simply put, this is a way of comparing the baseline to the actual resource usage in such a way as to evaluate the productivity you are achieving. Using the productivity achieved up to date, you then make a projection to the end of your project to find out if you're heading for an overshoot, either in time, missing the deadline, or in budget, spending more than you have, or worst case, maybe both of them. Now be prepared for some overload of abbreviations, as I will talk you through the key concepts of EVA. And as said, that is the abbreviation of Earned Value Analysis. The 3 key concepts are PV, or Planned Value. This is the same as BCWS, which is Budgeted Cost of Work Scheduled. The second one is AC, or Actual Cost, and that's the same as ACWP, or Actual Cost of Work Performed. And then we have EV, or Earned Value, and that's the same as BCWP, or Budgeted Cost of Work Performed. The key takeaway here is, of course, that any baseline planning assumes some baseline productivity. As an example, if you estimate an effort of 100 hours to produce component X, then that sets a baseline productivity goal. If your team needs 200 hours to produce that component X, they're only half as productive as what you have planned for. The problem here is in assessing semi-finished work. If your team has spent 50 hours on component X, the easy assumption is that they are 50% complete, but that is almost never the case. You must not only capture the actual time they have already spent, but also ask them again and again and again how much more time they think they need to finish component X. If they need another 50 hours, then they are on track. But if they need another 75 hours, they will go 25% over the budgeted hours for this. Should that hold for everything in your project, you will be both late and over budget. So using EVA, Earned Value Analysis, is the only way to avoid the 90% complete syndrome, where a team keeps telling you every week that they're almost done, but keep using more time week upon week. If they've spent 90 hours and told you last week that only 10 more hours are needed, but then tell you the same story this week, after spending 40 more hours on it, it's definitely time for a serious talk with them about their effort estimation for this particular task. And especially so when you have more similar tasks in your project that are yet to start. By using the planned value, actual value and earned value, you can start doing what is called a variance analysis of your project while it is still running. And that's where it's valuable, because then you can still make corrections. So applying earned value analysis is something you should do right from the start, because the early corrections have much more impact than later corrections. So to add 2 more abbreviations, we have schedule variance, which is a projection if you will meet the deadline or not. Schedule variance, SV, is calculated as earned value minus planned value. And then you have cost variance, which is a projection if you will make the budget or not. So CV, cost variance, is calculated as earned value minus actual cost. I would understand if you're a bit confused with all these abbreviations and formulas from just listening here. So I've put a pointer to various websites on earned value analysis on projectdoctor.online. Now let's wrap it up. What has been covered in this podcast episode? In this episode of the Canvas series, I've covered the various types of resources that you will need in your project and how to procure them. And I've talked about how to track and report on the actual usage of these resources with a technique called earned value analysis. Now please go to projectdoctor.online to download the extra materials with this episode and also to check out the other episodes that I've mentioned here. Subscribe or follow the podcast so you won't have to miss an episode. And let me know your comments and reviews. I'll be very happy to hear from you. Thank you for listening.